The more I think about what we're trying to do in this class, the more I think about it, the more I realize just how important it is what we're talking about. We're talking basically about the idea, as we said in our first lesson, that every society, and frankly, every collection of human beings, I mean, we see this in communities, we see this in churches, we see this in families. Every collection of human beings has those who are, for lack of a better word, the elites, the ones at the top, the ones with the power, the ones with the wealth, the ones with the prestige. And we have usually the great majority of the rest of the group, the population, those at the bottom. And what we're saying, very simple, is that the Old Testament mostly, but certainly biblical faith, wants not to make the elites more elite and to stretch out any given group of people so that there are people are higher and people are lower, but rather to move in the opposite direction, to squeeze societies together. Now, you may think, well, I'm just hearing this for the first time, and I can understand that because, and here's why. We have received the biblical tradition. That's one element that's coming out of the ancient world, and there are actually other elements. There are other societies, other cultures that surrounded ancient Israel or surrounded the place where the biblical materials, mostly the Old Testament, came into being. And information about those societies now is reaching us. This accelerated greatly in the middle of the 19th century as archaeological finds and interpretation and study enabled scholars and others to recognize what was going on elsewhere outside of Israel. And when we then set Israel against the background of its peer nations or peer societies, suddenly we see that Israel did a lot of things quite differently. They made significant breaks from what was going on. And we're putting together in this class about 5 different ways that those breaks took place. They're very different, but they had the same effect. And the effect was simply this compressing of the societies so that the people were more on a par. The fancy word is the Bible works towards creating egalitarian situations. And this is really a big deal for life in a lot of different ways. Just, look around at the political situation that we're living in. There is a worldwide political movement that is raising the question whether liberal democracy has gone way too far in bringing people on a par. There are peoples of different cultures that are on the move, that they're encroaching upon European countries, encroaching, well, really all over the world, but certainly coming into America, mostly through our southern border. And this has stirred up scores of controversies. Which group maybe is the original group? Which group is entitled to the benefits or to the wealth of a country? Should migrants from different cultures be able to move into a new country and automatically enjoy all the rights and the opportunities and the privilege and the power and the prestige of the others who have lived in that place for a long time, maybe multiple generations? We're raising the question around our politics. Should the head of state be able to bypass legislative say-so on every decision and to be able to execute decisions. In other words, to have more power. Should the president enjoy that? Should men basically head their households, and should childbearing and domesticity be the women's natural role? Is there a hierarchy that comes in homes? Should a state have an official religion? Is, for example, Christianity the top religion? Judaism, biblical religion, or are they on a par, or is there some other answer to that? All of these questions, and really many others, have at their heart the question of hierarchy. And Americans are rightfully proud of our own constitutional heritage, which significantly compresses, in a lot of ways, compresses hierarchy. Basically, the Constitution works to disempower the head of state, to disempower even the majority is somewhat disempowered in the United States, and by the same token, grants power and say-so and rights to individual common citizens. And now what we're saying in the class is that biblical religion, especially that of ancient Israel, operated by principles that in fact compressed those who were at the top and those who were at the bottom. Now, today we're going to talk about really the first, or one of the first issues, and that is we're going to talk about economic power and empowerment. And probably we understand this pretty effortlessly, and that is that in the ancient world, basically in the Bronze Age, life was much more difficult. Life was much more straightforward, and frankly, life was, economically speaking, much more harsh. The basic unit of wealth in antiquity was land, and land was valuable in significant part because of the crops that it could produce and the livestock that could be sustained on that land. And therefore, who owned the land and how much of the land was owned really was a big determinant as to who was powerful, and then who labored on the land and to whom belonged the fruits of that labor and that land. That's another question. So in the ancient world, again, we're talking about the Bronze Age, peasants may have owned a plot of land and eked out a living from it themselves. But for the most part, kings and the other elites that surrounded or came close in power to that of the kings, and that would be the priests and the intellectuals, the scribes, and others, these groups also had a tendency to own great tracts of land that could be sold or could be worked by low-status peasants or slaves. And, that is how the elite group of people became more elite. And then in some instances where families owned plots of land, a poor crop due to whatever cause, maybe a drought, or maybe the sickness of the farmer in the family or the farmers in the family would create a crisis where there was nothing to eat, nothing to sell. And then that raised a question, how to get the family fed, and then how to put out a crop in the following season. So sometimes peasants who were in difficulty had to borrow money, and then they had a greater kind of pressure that if things did not go well the following season, then they were unable to pay off loans. Sometimes they would, if they owned any land, they were able to sell the land, and in order to, but that became a limiting kind of factor because they would have less property to plant their crops on, graze their livestock on. So you can see that for those who were in difficulty, indebtedness, the precariousness of crops, sickness of any kind, death of a family member, all of these kinds of things really could threaten the very survival of people. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the unique circumstances of Israel's coming into being and their existence. First of all, Israel was a new society in the ancient Near East, or a newer society. We read in the Bible that Abraham came out of Haran, that was in Mesopotamia, that the people who had been enslaved in Egypt, they came out of Egypt. These were all much older societies, and the people of God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants, all settled in the land of Canaan, which is today's Palestine, or now it's Israel. And in each of the instances of the people coming into the land, particularly the escape of the Hebrew people out of Egypt, this was interpreted as a tremendous rescue of people. This is basically the core story of the Old Testament. That is the rescue of the Hebrew people from Egypt. They knew themselves to be a rescued people. There was a great lift that came from as a act of grace on God's part towards the Hebrew people. And so Israel's sense of itself came from being singled out among other people in its point of distress and weakness and total powerlessness, and being delivered out of a probably what they considered, what anyone would consider, a hopeless situation of slavery in Egypt. Israel came to know itself as a rescued people, and then it was taken into its own special place and allowed to flourish as a society, and so on. I say this because this is distinct from the way that other societies understood their own coming into being. Most societies thought of their existence as one that grew out of creation, whatever the creation myth or story that they held was one that basically served to help the people understand themselves as having a divine aspect about them. The god or the gods, usually it was the gods usually, had acted together in such a way, and the one overall god or the chief god, I'm speaking generally now, there are several of these creation myths, and they come to define the nature of the society. The society of Babylon, not the earliest of societies in the area of Mesopotamia, understood itself to have issued from the triumph of one of the deities named Marduk, who was a warrior type of god who defeated the saltwater dragon Tiamat, and it was on her, Tiamat's, dead carcass that the society that later came to be known as Babylon came to be. So societies understood themselves as going all the way back to the creation, their idea of the creation of things, and creation was the founding myth of several different societies. That was typical in the ancient world. Israel was different. Israel understood itself to have come along from in the midst of such societies into its own being as a group of people who had been rescued. So rescued by a single God, Yahweh. So right there you have a significant difference where, say, in a Mesopotamian society, there was a pantheon of gods, multiple gods, and a chief god that corresponded with the ruling elite in the society that resulted in the world. In Babylon, multiple gods. In Israel, there was even if they had notions of several other gods, the God with whom Israel had something to do was Yahweh, the God who had rescued them. Now, there's another principle that's important to talk about, and that is that God gave to Israel a law code. Right, we remember in the story they came out of Egypt and went to right away, really, to Mount Sinai, and they received the Ten Commandments, and then that continued with the oral law, which Moses kept in his head and delivered by stages to the people as they continued in the wilderness, and then preeminently as just at the point when they entered into Canaan. The entire book of Deuteronomy is the deposit of law that Moses had retained in his head. Now, the theological point of the law was there are several ways that the law is important to the what became the Jewish people, those who occupied Israel, and one of the most important aspects of the law was that in observing and learning from the law, for the entire society to do that, the people were able to re-experience in essence and in a theological way, they were able to re-experience the Exodus itself. In other words, there's deliverance from slavery that comes with observing the law. So an Israelite could experience the same experience of being rescued by God without necessarily having to have lived in the generation that was in slavery in Egypt and then came out of slavery into the wilderness and so on. So, and if you look at the law, if you look at that law, you can see that there are several elements in it that make it clear that they're basically coming out of, or it's basically with reference to slavery. And the one that always comes to mind is the Sabbath requirement. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. One of the commandments is this was certainly a wonderful day off for a people who had a 24/7 life of servitude, making bricks in the land of Egypt. So suddenly we see an element of liberation structured into the law, and it's certainly a conviction that the entire law is an element of liberation. So there again is that theme of deliverance from Egypt, which is embodied in the law itself. Now I'd like to talk about a couple of things that most people, even those of us who may have a superficial awareness of what might be in the Bible, know all of these factors in the Bible individually, but maybe haven't had an opportunity to think of them as they work together. And I want to explain how that works along with the kinds of things that we're talking about right now. When Israel came out of Egypt and through the wilderness, when they entered into the land in Canaan, after the occupants who were there to some degree were expelled and so on, the tribes of Israel were the land was apportioned to them, so that each tribe, all of us have seen these maps of Israel where the 12 tribes, the descendants of Jacob, the 12 names that we're familiar with, how each of these tribes ended up with some territory that belonged to them. And then there was a sort of a subdivision of land, as it was also divided between clans and then individual families and so on. The upshot is that everyone had been given a piece of land, so that fundamental, what we said at the beginning, at that fundamental unit of wealth had been apportioned to some degree to each family. Each Israelite had his or her own piece of land in theory. And so that created a very interesting situation, very different from the societies that existed around it, where the king began to own the land and then could do with the land as the king pleased, or the temple owned the land and could do with it as they pleased. In the Bible, Israel occupies the land. Now, notice I'm being careful not to say owns the land, because God owns the land. That's the biblical principle. But the land and its produce and it's the security that goes along with land ownership or occupancy, permanent occupancy, all of that accrued to the people. So now that principle is laid out in the book of Joshua, and it's worth looking at the 13th through the 19th chapter of the book of Joshua in the Old Testament to see how carefully. I mean, that's almost like the county records of who owns what in a community, because it's at great length. It's laid out in the Bible who owns all of the different plots of ground. Now, why is this important? Well, to begin with, everybody's got that unit of productivity. It's not concentrated in the hands of the elite. It is distributed into the possession or occupancy of everyone. And the king doesn't necessarily own great tracts of land, nor does the priestly class. The Levites in Israel actually owned no land at all and were entirely dependent upon the donations of those who did own the land and who were able to create wealth out of it. So right there, the starting point is an egalitarian one. And when you have a situation, if you think about it, when you have a situation where families are located proximate to other family members, my uncle lives in the over on the field that's adjacent to ours, and I have a cousin who's down a road from us. In other words, kinship, the clan is existing, and this creates community bonds. between family members, where situations where families and related people are all jumbled up, that isn't so much true. But the unique situation of Israel, having moved into Canaan and then having been all settled at the same time, it could be arranged that way. It could be arranged that kinship connections could remain or could start as being proximate to one another. And of course, you know how that goes. If it's one thing if your next door neighbor, needs a lawnmower, and it's like, I don't know if I want to loan that to him. We don't get along that well in the first place. But if that person's your cousin, it's like, well, you're kind of honor bound to, to help out. Maybe help with the chores. Maybe share equipment or seeds, or maybe work a little bit for one another. So that then right there becomes a poverty fighting the proximity of families. So that becomes the primary arrangement of Israel, the organization of the society as a whole. Now we mentioned law, and this is where the law interacts with that settlement arrangement, families working together, and the law that governs this we would call the Jubilee regulations. They're found in the book of Leviticus. We don't much look at Leviticus, and often we don't really deem Leviticus as all that important, because it seems like it's so very ancient. It's coming out of an agrarian society of antiquity. It talks about the concerns of an agricultural people and so on. But there are principles that are articulated there which are very instructive. And one of them is that after going back to land tenure, after let me back up a little bit and say that the Jubilee regulations are all structured on the organization of time. So we got the organization of space, we got the organization of time. Every 7 days, for example, that we read about in the year of the Jubilee, every 7 days comes a day of rest. We mentioned that before. And then what happens on the day of rest? Well, livestock and labor and land, everything just lies fallow. And then there's a great deal of very wise and very powerful elements of social justice, economic justice, that are structured around this Jubilee year. Now, the Jubilee year is a 7 times 7 calculation. It's the organization of time, basically 7 times 7 years, which is 49 or around 50 years. There's some dispute as to the exact amount of time, but about every half century, the Jubilee year comes along, and no matter what has happened in the previous, couple of generations, it's a fairly long period of time, all of the people who, for whatever circumstances have taken place, the changes that have taken place, the things that people have needed to do to survive, if they've borrowed money, or if they've needed to become servants of people, or if they are coming to work in different places, all of that is reset. I call this the original factory reset, where all of the people return to their original place of their original land allotment in the area of their kinship in their tribe. Everyone is is restored, and you know how the real world always works is that the rich become richer and the poor become poorer, and that was probably always the case even in ancient times, but that's all changed. This phenomenon of generational poverty, that if your grandparents are poor, you're going to be poor. That is not able to happen. There is this reset where everybody returns to the place where their ancestors had been originally settled and allotted to. Now, if you think about that, that creates a lot of very interesting situations in the meantime, because in the ancient world, the practice of releasing people from debts or releasing people from slavery was, or allowing people to return to their ancestral lands, that took place. I mean, this was not entirely an invention of Israel, but what was an invention of Israel is that the timing of the Jubilee was based on the calendar. In other words, it, in theory, rolled around regularly every 50 years. It simply happened. That means that you could look forward to it. And then that had an influence on the economy of the situation. In other words, if a family had been impoverished and they needed to sell their land, of course they couldn't sell their land because it didn't belong to them, it belonged to God, and they were going to return to it at some point in the future. So basically what happened is that land would be leased. We would call it a leasing arrangement. So an impoverished family would lease their land to someone who was more prosperous, and knowing that lease was time limited, and so the lease was the value of the lease was calculated by the number of crop years that could be anticipated before the Jubilee year, and then. So there's an interesting mix of a planned egalitarian economy with a free market economy where both of those could operate within the same economic framework or situation. Another thing that happened in the Jubilee year is that slaves were released. Again, from ancient times. Kings would grant their subjects various forms of amnesty, forgiveness of debt, and release from slavery. Again, these edicts were issued at the beginning of a monarch's reign, though occasionally, the king would release slaves or cancel debts in response to, you can't have your whole kingdom enslaved or owning no land or non-productive, and so even for the sake of the economy of a community, the king would grant people release from some of these harsh circumstances. So slaves were returned were able to return to their land. So here again, the working together of land being allotted, land owned by God, and then periodically restored to its original people, had a way of keeping the elites and for wealth to drift upwards inexorably, and for the poor to more and more sink down in a kind of grinding poverty. Instead, in the biblical vision, it seems pretty clear that if we want to have an idea of what God wants to see among people, it would be a much more equal society. Now, I'd like to talk about a couple of other factors that were in place along the lines of economic justice. One of those is the law of tithing. And in the 14th chapter of Deuteronomy, we find some of these laws. Tithing was an interesting merger of civic and religious contribution obligations that were necessary for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Levites needed to have their, they needed to eat, and they needed to have some money, basically, to live. But the tithing regulations in ancient Israel avoided the kinds of grotesque situations that could be seen in the societies around them. Babylon, for example, controlled, because of the tithes, the religious obligations, which were, theologically legitimized because they had to do with the temple. They came to ownership of vast amounts of grain and livestock and land, because the priests who were elite were able to get rich from this. In Israel, it's interesting to read Deuteronomy's law code, because there is actually a social program, to use a contemporary expression, based on tithing. The social program is that the farmers, say, who offered tithes at the Jerusalem temple, would be able to take back their own gift in the temple and make personal purchases. So every 3 years, tithes were collected specifically for the Levite class of people, but also for those who were poor, foreign, widows, orphans, and the destitute in society would receive a portion of those tithes for their own personal maintenance. And then on the other years, the givers of the tithes themselves were able to make their offering to God, but God didn't, as it were, keep those offerings, but allowed the farmers to have them back again, and they could be used maybe to purchase whatever, farm implements or seed, or whatever. Then finally, let me talk about interest in lending. Again, unlike other Middle Eastern societies, Israel uniquely forbade the charging of interests on loans. And this was a significant departure from the practices of the societies that surrounded Israel. Lending and interest in the Mesopotamian and Mediterranean world were certainly important and integral to society. I mean, different societies had invented loans and interest payments and so on. It didn't take long for people from the Bronze Age to use those practices. Interest rates were primitive then. They and were high by our standards. Regular loans charged a standard interest rate of 20%, and loans of grain charged an interest rate of 33%. So that was a considerable markup. And those who had money to lend were in a position to acquire a pretty good return on their investment, when they did lend money. Interestingly enough, in Israel, the charging of interest was simply not allowed. Israelites, that is, the charging of interest to another Israelite, basically someone who is considered akin to you couldn't charge interest to that person. Now, Israelites were allowed to charge interest, as was the practice throughout the Mediterranean, on people who lived outside of Israel. But again, the sharing of money was a form of mutual aid and not personal enrichment in theory in the ancient world. So taken together, there's a pretty powerful theme of equalizing society as far as the finances are concerned in Israel. And I would say that just talking about the laws that we're mentioning in this class gives a pretty good indication that the Old Testament commitment for society not to become grotesquely hierarchical was a pretty big deal in the Old Testament. And I think when we combine that with the other areas that we're going to talk about, the literacy being a part for everyone, and then the political rules that disempowered the king and decentralized authority were important. The way that vernacular literature addressed itself to what we would call ordinary people, that all took its beginning in ancient Israel. And then the factor in the very creation of humans as of the image and likeness with God, their creator, with the same tasks that God has of overseeing and managing all of the rest of creation, and which is to say that every human being is a co-creator with his or her creator, God's self, makes the Old Testament, and certainly by extension the New Testament, a remarkably egalitarian document.